Hello, my name is Nia and I am a Programme Officer at the Brilliant Club. Before joining the Brilliant Club, I worked as an English teacher and then in English language curriculum development for an educational charity. So this session today will guide you through the concept of tutorial outcomes. Setting tutorial outcomes builds on the principle of backwards planning. It will help you when planning your activities, but it also helps the students to have a clear understanding of what they should gain from each week to continue to build their skills and knowledge towards the final assignment. So, in this session, we are going to continue our backwards planning journey to start to think about what you might want to include in individual tutorials in more detail. Specifically, we'll discuss learning outcomes and answer the following questions. 1. What is a learning outcome? 2. Why are they useful? And 3. Who are they useful for? So, what is a learning outcome? So learning outcomes define what pupils will have achieved by the end of a tutorial. Why are they useful? Well, they help you to identify and include activities that help pupils progress towards that tutorial's outcomes, as well as providing a roadmap towards that final assignment that you want your pupils to do really well in and achieve the maximum marks for that they possibly can. And who are they useful for finally? Well, they're useful both for tutors in terms of planning tutorials and checking pupils' progress within a particular tutorial to keep everyone on track. But they're also useful for pupils in that they enable pupils and empower pupils to check their own progress and see how a tutorial is helping them work towards a course's overall aims, whatever they might be. Learning outcomes can take many different forms, but here are some suggestions for how you might want to phrase your learning outcomes. So here are some examples to take a look at here. So if you want your learning outcomes to be phrased in a manner that's looking ahead to the learning that will take place during that session, by the end of the tutorial, I will be able to, for instance, might be one way that you could start a learning outcome. You might want to focus on some key questions that your students will consider throughout the course of the tutorial, for instance. So why does, to what extent do I agree with, does, for instance, okay? Or finally, you might want your learning outcome, that session, to take the form of a checklist or a task list. So for instance, you might want to start your learning outcome with the phrase identify, and then whatever it is that you expect the pupils to identify, or for instance explain the causes of a given phenomena or process or whatever it might be that you want them to consider that particular session. So now that we have a sense of what learning outcomes are and their purpose, let's look at how we can incorporate them into your backwards plan. Here we can see that the tutor has identified their final assignment question, as well as the subject knowledge and specific academic skills that will be important to success on that final assignment. The tutor uses these overall aims to backwards plan each tutorial to ensure that pupils build the necessary subject knowledge and practice vital academic skills. In thinking about your tutorial objectives, you want to ensure that pupils have a chance to develop all the knowledge and skills you have identified in your course aims. We suggest that you pause here to have a closer look at how these work together. Another important thing to consider is how to phrase your learning outcomes so that they are as pupil friendly as possible. This ensures that the learning outcomes are useful for both yourself and your pupils. Okay, it's really important that your pupils can understand and access what it is that they are aiming toward in order to get the most from these learning outcomes. Okay. So take a look at this example here, a learning outcome for tutorial 1, and consider what feedback you might give this tutor on their learning objectives. You can use the questions on the slide to inform your thinking. Please do go ahead and pause the video now to do this. You'll have developed your own points of feedback on this particular learning outcome that likely align with some of the things that we've highlighted here. Okay, so the outcome reads, by the end of the tutorial, you will be able to read a text on bacterial infections, recite 3 commonalities of all bacterial infections, and design your own bacteria. Okay, so a great thing here that the tutor has included in this particular outcome is that they've provided a clear time scale for pupils, so by the end of this tutorial. Okay, however, in general, this outcome is overly wordy. Okay, and they could here instead use 3 outcomes to be set out in bullet points to make it easier for pupils to read and to digest and also to process. It's almost like it functions kind of like a checklist then, 1, 2, 3, that gives them a clear indication of the steps that they need to have completed in order to have fulfilled the outcomes for that particular tutorial. They've used that term read, you're able to read a text on bacterial infections. Okay, so let's take a look at that term read there. Is read the best word that they could possibly use here? It doesn't really necessarily identify the skills that pupils will be using, the skill that pupils will be using in order to fulfill those 3 key learning outcomes. Identify main points might be a better phrase to use there, and substitute that for read. Recite 3 commonalities. Okay, now this gives a very clear goal to pupils, which is great. However, you might want to check that particular aim or outcome for ensuring that it's using pupil-friendly language here. Is there a simpler way of conveying this information? It might, 3 similarities, 3 common features, might be perhaps a more effective, more pupil-friendly way of phrasing that particular outcome. And design your own bacteria, of all bacterial infections, and design your own bacteria. So that sounds like a really fun activity. But this is worth here considering, could this be phrased to ensure that the learning is clear? What knowledge will pupils need to apply to create their own bacteria here? You might want to break down that outcome even further in order to make it really clear what it is that pupils will be doing in order to achieve that particular goal of designing, or outcome rather, of designing their own bacteria. So now we can have a go at drafting your own tutorial outcomes. So in your course design template, you'll be asked to identify the learning outcomes you plan to set for each tutorial. So the work that you do here right now will be directly transferable to the next phase of designing your course. You can either use a spare piece of paper or work directly into your tutor workbook. Don't worry too much about getting them exactly right at this stage, as we will revisit your drafted outcomes again later in this session. So please do pause the video here and draft your outcomes, considering the principles of backwards planning. Okay, you can use the questions on the slide here to guide your thinking on this. Just like you did with your concept map, take a look at your outcomes and ask yourself the following. First of all, whose stories and perspectives are missing from this material? Second of all, do any of the outcomes suggest that knowledge, civilization, or scientific discovery originated only in the West? Third, does the source material or data reflect a limited demographic? And fourth, can I find scholarship and sources that more faithfully represent the diversity of this discipline or the people it studies? So as discussed previously, this is not to say that your course can't do these things. Rather, we encourage you to ensure that you've critically engaged with these questions in your own planning and considered why this might be the case for your course. You can also use the toolkits to support pupils to critically engage with these questions as well if you choose to do so. Okay. The example on the next slide will also demonstrate how you can approach this. So let's take a look at a worked example that we have provided here of some decolonised outcomes. We have the before column on the left hand side here versus the after column on the right, and we can see there that that first outcome remains unchanged. Before, you will be able to label the parts of an animal cell, versus after, you'll be able to label the parts of an animal cell. Again, the second learning outcome, which refers to identifying the key structural features of DNA, remains unchanged in the after. However, it's this third point, isn't it? By the end of the tutorial, you will know who discovered DNA, and becomes by the end of the tutorial, you'll be familiar with the research done by a number of scientists to identify the structure of DNA. So by a number of scientists is the key change there. And while we don't want to include every possible detail, the change to the final outcome signposts that the discovery of DNA was not something done by just two individuals. The widely known narrative, of course, is that DNA was discovered by Watson and Crick, who won the Nobel Prize for their article in Nature on its structure, but the work of a team that included a much wider group of researchers, among them Rosalind Franklin, Maurice Wilkins, and a student, Ray Gosling. And that final learning outcome acknowledges the wider contribution of research that was done by a team of individuals rather than the common or the widely known narrative that is discovered by Watson and Crick is sort of disrupted slightly here and corrected somewhat. Now please pause again and check your outcomes against the self-assessment questions. If you're not sure how to check if the outcomes are clear and pupil friendly, it might be worth checking with a friend or relative who is a non-specialist. It's a good idea whenever possible to set a clear time in your learning outcomes. So for instance, in this tutorial might be a good way to start a learning outcome, and a clear number of things for students to do or achieve within that learning outcome. So for example, in this tutorial, we will identify how natural imagery is used in two poems. Make sure that the objectives are clearly and explicitly linked to the material you are delivering in the tutorial. Links that we might see readily as researchers won't be obvious to students. And generally, it is better to repeat the same terms exactly each and every time in order to be clear. And finally, check these aims link to the course as a whole in order to be really clear on what kind of progress pupils are making in each tutorial. Now review and refine your outcomes and add them to your backwards planning template in your tutor workbook. As with your final and baseline assignments, it's likely you revise these multiple times. This is to be expected and very much a part of the process of planning to support learning. So once you have drafted your outcomes, you can then begin to consider the case studies, sources or other materials to support pupils to achieve these objectives. The next session will explore how you can select the case studies or other source materials that best support the learning outcomes you have developed. That brings us to the end of this training session. When you're ready, you can move on to the final step of the backwards planning journey, identifying what activities, case studies or resources you might want to include in each tutorial. Thank you.